Okay, I think we can kick off. So, first of all, good morning to all. Thank you all for joining this session that we are conducting today. This is one of the many webinars that we do annually. So, this day we are conducting the same webinar on ISO 9001 amendment that happened recently in Feb 2024 regarding climate impact. Next slide. So, like I said, this session is going to be about climate change amendment in ISO 9001, which was a recent amendment. We can no longer call it as recent because it's almost a year or more since the amendment actually came into practice. But what we have seen when we are going through some client interaction is that they had struggle or a confusion of understanding what is the real requirement here. Why is it different from a 14,001, or what is the expectation on different kind of industries? Is there a requirement to actually follow this? So there are a lot of confusions, and we have also seen that when we attend the external audits for with customers, we have seen that they also have these questions being raised by external auditors, even for different kind of industries. So we thought we'll have this session to just clear the eye, clear the mind, just make everyone understand what is the expectation and what is, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end as well. So if you have any questions at any point of time, feel free to use the chat at that point. We have a team that's looking at the chat as well, and we'll go through all these questions and anything additional in the Q&A session at the end as well. So just to give an update, a few of you might already know me from, you may be one of our client, or you may have attended one of our past webinars. But otherwise, my name is Sanjay Shivakumar. I'm the Advisory and Audit Services Lead at Anitech, and I'll be conducting this session for you. So just to give a quick introduction again, I've been working with Anitech for the past 5 years. My area of specialization was quality, safety, environment, and sustainability. And I've been working with the clients, setting up their systems or maintaining the system, maintaining the certification, compliance checks, and any other requirements a client may have in terms of management system requirements or a legislative requirement for that fact. And I've worked with a wide variety of industries as well in this space, so that gives me a good understanding what can be the different scenarios that we may go through this session. So just so why are we here? So many of you are here because potentially you are also confused. Why is there a difference here? What do we need to do? You may not be in a traditional environmental issue causing business that requires to have a climate related consideration. What could I expect? So that's what we are trying to understand here. Now, this is not an explanation of a 14,001 system for those who know, or an environment management system. It might be a byproduct of this requirement, which we'll go through when we look at some sample scenarios that I'm presenting at the end. So what ISO wants us to know is climate change an impact on us? Is climate change going to impact the business in some way or the other? And if so, what are we going to do about it? So that's what we are trying to understand here. And most importantly, how do we comply? How do we show compliance to this requirement without having any complications in the next certification or a surveillance audit? So the main thing that we need to understand here is that the change is specifically for clause 4.1 and 4.2. So 4.1, as you know, is about understanding the context of the organization. So when we look at context of the organization, what we're trying to understand is there any issues that are internal or external to the business that may affect the service, the quality of the service or the product that we are going to give to the customer? So earlier, this was purely around the quality of the service delivery aspect. Now we have to also consider if climate change can impact the quality of service. We are not trying to assess if we have a climate impact. It might be a byproduct of that, which I'll explain. But most importantly, we are trying to assess if there's a climate change that can impact the quality of the service or the product that we are giving out. A simple example might be that we are selling ice creams on the street. Now, if the climate temperature is rising every year, and the temperature has risen 1 degree, 2 degrees after 10 years, am I able to sell the same ice cream with the same equipment that I have? Maybe not, because the ice creams are melting faster because the temperature has risen. That's the simplest example I can give. But there are much more complex scenarios that can impact this, which we'll go through in this session. The second aspect is clause 4.2, which is the main element that has been affected as well. So here we have to understand, is someone else expecting us to know our climate impact and make changes for that? So in this case, we as a business, I did not have a requirement to check my climate impact. I don't want to spend on that. Understood. But is there a customer or a third party has a vested interest in us and is asking us to make sure our climate impact is minimized, which may then trigger us to understand our climate impact and maybe require us to have a environment management system or EST compliance system or something like that at that point. So that's what I said when I mentioned ISO 9001 is not a 14001, or it's not. This is not requiring a 14001, but it may trigger us to have a 14001 as a byproduct of this change. So basically, what we need to understand is our operation going to have an issue internally or externally because of climate impact? If yes, what we have to do, what is the strategy planning we have to do, what is the risk management we have to do around that? Also, stay but as when we consider stakeholders, is there a requirement externally for us to have a climate consideration? It might be from a customer, it might be from when we are a part of the supply chain for a corporate business. It might be that they are making sure everyone in the supply chain is having a net zero commitment or a green sustainability practice in their operation or something like that. So these can trigger us to understand there is a climate impact that I need to consider and I need to manage in my business. So what happens depends on what type of control we need to implement, depends on what is the requirement, what is the risk, what is the issues, what is the expectation externally, and that will decide based on different aspects, which we'll go through in this webinar. So why did this basically happen initially? This was basically a byproduct of a ISO members meeting, which is called ISO London Declaration from 2021. So basically, this declaration took a pledge to embed climate consideration into every stage of standard development, ensuring all new standards revised in the international standards support a sustainable and resilient future. So it may not be evident in now, but what they have taken a commitment is that any new standard that is being made or any new standard that is being updated, it will potentially have a chance that climate impact is required to be considered there. What we have seen recently in some of our client sites where the audits were related to 27001, which is information security for those who know, climate change consideration was asked by the external auditors in that case. So it's a requirement to understand if climate change can affect your information security. For example, a blackout because of an energy shortage. What will your information security do at that point? How will it sustain in such a scenario? So every standard can have potential implication when there's a climate change to it, which will be successively rolled out in different standards, which you can see in the coming years. So how would this affect your business? So the way it affects your business depends on what you do, what industry you are in, what are the stakeholders that have a vested interest in you, where are you located, and previous history of similar industries having effect from climate change. A lot of factors can affect this. If I be more specific, it can be that the product and services that you give has an impact. Your supply chain and who you're supplying to can have an impact. Geography can take an impact. When I mean geography, it means where you are located. It might have different implications. So where you're located might have a climate related risks such as a flood or a heat wave that might be required to be taken into consideration, or there might be because of a local regulation or a federal requirement that needs to be compensated for or managed. It might be that it's not there in a different location where you're there, but it's there in another country where you have a different office. And like I mentioned at the beginning as well, if there's a specific customer requirement that may trigger this as well. But this is not the only case, but it can have different implications on this. Now, what I try to do here is, even though the specific requirement is to clause 4.1 and 4.2, does that mean we just need to show wherever 4.1 and 4.2 is managed in our management system? It's not as simple as that. We have to understand when in 4.1 and 4.2, we are identifying why it's relevant for us to consider climate change. Who is asking us to consider climate change? Once we have that listed out, once we have that identified at the base, what we need to understand is which other clauses may get affected. So these are not the only case. I just took some sample cases to show you what could potentially be the changes in the other clauses and how it might affect your management system as a whole. Maybe it only affects one of these clauses for you. Maybe it affects other clauses as well. For example, 4.3. So 4.3, when we are looking at the scope of the management system, what we need to understand is when I was talking about geography, we found that where we are located for the past 20 years is going to be affected by a specific kind of a climate impact. Maybe it's increasingly affected by floods and it's affecting our productivity. So then we have to change the location of, we are now deciding to change the location. So now the scope and where the factory is located is going to change. So 4.3 is affected in that case. 6.1, very easily, if you find some issues in 4.1 and 4.2 that needs to be controlled, it will affect the risk management process or the opportunity management process, and that will affect clause 6.1. Now, for managing that, if we decide there are certain number of changes in the processes, procedures, work methods, locations, or something else, there are changes involved, then that changes may have to be managed in a systematically planned way. Now, say for a climate impact, you require certain new controls in place, and that certain new controls will require maybe more human resource support, maybe some change in your environment, some change in your infrastructure, like a machine or some monitoring systems or something like that. Then you have to understand what changes in clause 7.1 support that may be affecting your business. Clause 8.2. So this a bit ties up with clause 4.2. If there's a customer requirement that is asking you to have a climate disclosure or a climate issue management system or environment management system, then the customer is asking us to show evidence that we have that commitment, we have done what is required. So it might be that that customer requirement identification under clause 8.2 might be affected, and you might have to take actions against that. It might be that you have to disclose how you comply with this on your website, or you have an environment management policy and commitments that dictate how you are committed to this, or you have to have a third party assessment on your carbon footprint or something like that. But the initial requirement is that the customer requirements were identified as part of this assessment. It doesn't stop there. I'm just saying these are few sample cases where this might be affected. 8.3, this is very crucial. So the major part of the effect might be that your product is causing a direct impact because of your packaging or because of its end of life, or a certain stage it's creating some chemicals or some toxic byproducts that might not be environment friendly. So then we have to understand that risk and take design measures at the beginning to make sure that throughout the life cycle of that product, from cradle to cradle or cradle to grave, we have designed it in such a way that it has climate impact considerations and minimize climate impact. So when we have a requirement to be sustainable or consider our climate impact, there is a chance that we have to check if our suppliers or people who provide us services are also doing the same thing and giving us ethically sourced product or products in a where they have considered their climate impact as well. That's where we have to consider clause 8.4. Then there might be there are specific cases that I'm discussing on 8.5 as well. We have to change our production or production process or services, which might require us to affect our clause 8.5. Now, this does not work without a proper monitoring system. When we need to monitor climate impact and how we need mechanisms to monitor the same. So that means we'll have to understand how much additional monitoring mechanisms we have to implement, which might impact our clause 9.1. Now, we have to discuss how this affects our overall management system, and this has to be considered in the management review, which is affecting clause 9.3. Clause 10, if there is any deviations on our planned mechanisms and if there's any deviations in our controls, we have to have corrective actions. So potentially, because of this climate change, a whole other clauses might get affected. And we may not need all of them, but we might need some of them. So it's about understanding, first of all, what are the impacts that we have, what are the expectations that we have externally, and what are the effects that it has on our existing system or a system that we are going to develop. So to understand this, I've just curated a few potential scenarios based on what I've read, and this should give us a better understanding of what could be expected and what could be the response. So let's take a case of a electronic manufacturer that's working, that's world renowned, and consider you as that business and consider if what could be your climate impact or what is the impact on your service delivery when there's a climate impact on your business. So in this case, I have mentioned that potentially if you are an electronic manufacturer and supplying things to other customers, if there is a climate event where there is a storm or a flood that's causing a delay in shipment or raw materials that's coming to you or from you to your customers, it might cause major issues on your revenue and overall business progression. Now, this is not just hypothetical. I don't know how many of you remember this. We had a major shortage in the uh, automotive industry in the last couple of years. It was not just because of a climate impact, but it was because of COVID and several other factors as well. But one of the reasons for the automotive shortage for vehicles here in Australia, especially, was that there was a chip shortage that has caused across the globe, which was related to floods in some countries across the world, which caused there was shortage in chips, which caused shortage in the ability of automotive business to provide vehicles on time. They're still getting back, and a lot of countries have taken the advantage of the shortage and started investing in chip manufacturing industries as well. But that's a separate thing. But this is how you consider this requirement. So it's not that the business had an impact on the climate is what they're considering here. It's what they're considering here is a climate change that happened around their geography due to storms and floods caused an impact on their ability to provide quality products or services. That's what this is about. It's about building resilience. It's about understanding what could go wrong in the next 10 years, next 20 years, next 30 years, and making sure the business can sustain and live through potential climate impacts. It's not like we can understand all possible scenarios because natural events, natural calamities are involved here, but it's about potentially expecting based on historical events what could potentially be the climate impact of all the services that I give as a business and what could have been done to protect it. So if you are such a manufacturer and you see that you have potentially these kind of risks of a storm or flood causing delays, uh, what you could do is you have a vulnerability assessment on the suppliers and understood a secondary sourcing strategies. You manage and have separate procurement policies to ensure you have alternate methods to procure the supply, and considering added extra lead times in case this kind of events might happen again in the future. But what you accept in this depends on the cost factor, and uh, when you assess risk versus cost, you understand what's viable for implementing. Now, when we look at in this case, what were the clauses that were affected is there was a risk that needed to be managed, clause 6.1. There were some operational change, supply chain related changes that needed to be implemented, which was clause 8.4. And generally, the implementation is to ensure there is a resilience embedded into the system. Let's take another sample of a textile company where there's a heat sensitive production requirement. So, like it's mentioned, there's a specific process in that industry where there's a bonding mechanism where there's and it requires a specific temperature, humidity, and control to ensure the bonding is perfect. But it's designed in the geography where it is. It's designed and developed based on the temperature and humidity of that location. Let's take that scenario. But as we know, the temperature around the world is increasing a bit by bit every year. So when there are these minute processes happening, the potential for the quality of the manufactured product to be defective, even for a slight change in temperature, is quite big. So then we have to ensure we have controls in place for ensuring such events don't happen, or when such climate impact is happening around us, we are still secure. Now we can't do this on a day when the climate impact happens. We have to be prepared for this. That's what this clause is about, or what that's what this is about. So what could have been done? So they could install some climate control environment system which automatically automates and regulates the system or environment in the production area. But whether it's viable, whether the cost is effective, it depends on what the business is doing. Maybe it's even viable for them to just move locations. It depends on where and what the business is doing. They could adjust the quality checks and the process parameters to ensure this is not affected. And they could implement monitoring systems on the rejection rates, or incorporate temperature thresholds into production systems where when it's above a certain point of temperature, they stop production or something like that, which is an administrative control. So these are potential responses this company could do, but it depends on specific company, location, the availability of resource in terms of finance to implement this. So in this case, what is affected is clause 4.1, which is where they understood the issue. They understood it's around the environment of operation. So it's clause 7.1.4, and they had to change their production processes, the parameters, the threshold. So it's clause 8.5, production control. Again, these are not the only clauses that might be affected, but these are potential clauses that could be affected in this case. Let's take another scenario here. So this is regarding a healthcare, or let's take a case of a medical device supplier. And in this case, we are taking a scenario where they have a requirement from a client or from their parent company that they have to be net zero by 2030. And they are only going to deal with customers or suppliers that can be net zero by 2030. Now, if you don't understand this, maybe that a customer has not reached to you yet saying we want this, but you can sense around the industry that everyone's going for that, but you are waiting for them to tell you this. But if you learn about this in 2029, that won't be enough. You won't have time. So you have to be proactive and understand now, checking if there's a climate related impact. Now, this is around clause 4.2, where you're understanding a stakeholder that has a vested interest in you to understand your climate impact and make a change for the betterment of the requirement. Now, understand the difference here. In environment management system, you are checking your impact on the climate change. The requirement here or in 9001 is to understand if climate change has an impact on you. Now, in this case, what happened is uh, because of climate change happening around, there's a customer or a stakeholder requirement for you to understand your climate impact, which might then trigger you to create a 14001 or ISO, an environment management system. So indirectly, you have to check your climate impact and minimize that. So indirectly, you are now requiring a green system or an environmental friendly system. But the primary requirement, again, not to be confusing, is not about looking at your impact on climate, but the requirement is to check climate impact on you. So in this case, the response could be that they did a carbon footprint assessment, understood what could be done to reduce the impact. They transitioned to renewable energy sources at the manufacturing sites, and they updated their quality and supplier assessment process to include environment performance as well. So potentially, like I said, this is around clause 4.2. So because it's a requirement from your stakeholder to understand this, because you had to look at your supply chain as well, you are looking at clause 8.4. Now, because you have to now look at the performance of your suppliers and your own performance, clause 9.1 can be related to this change. Let me take another sample here. So this is a cold chain distribution network, and this is like the ice cream vendor that I was mentioning in the beginning. This provider has to send things across Australia or the continent or anywhere across the world, and there is a increase in temperatures around. And what could the person do? And this could also be considered where there is a huge heat wave that's unplanned temperature event that could potentially happen as well. So this is again an impact of climate change on our ability to provide a service to the customer and the quality of the service or the product that's being delivered. Again, in this case, we the potential response could be that we have insulated containers, we have temperature loggers that monitoring this. There are contingency plans to have alternate routes when there is potential heat waves. Uh, if they have had scenarios before, they can assess the past data and take alternate routes in different weathers, and training the drivers to have protocols when there is a huge difference in temperatures. Now, again, the clauses that might be affected here is clause 6.1, where we have to control the risk. There is change in the way the service is delivered, so clause 8.5. Because training was involved, so clause 7.2 potentially is invoked here. I like to take a case of an opportunity here. Now, always risk and opportunity is important. So in this case, when we are talking about opportunities, um, it was like that previous case I mentioned. Now, at the moment, this is a case of a furniture manufacturing company. At the time, there is no requirement from a customer yet to asking, uh, do you sell sustainable products? Maybe they haven't received it yet, but they still see that other industries are moving to that kind of a marketing strategy, and they see that they're getting more incentives, they're getting more exposure, they're getting more customers because of that commitment already. So here they are going to look at their impact of on climate and reduce that. But where it originated from is that when they looked at any stakeholders who have vested interest, they understood that customers want companies to provide these kind of products in sustainable way, which is ethically sourced, which is reducing the impact on the climate as well. So what this provider could do is basically shift to sustainable timber, redefine product for recycling. That's the design 8.3 for the life cycle, introduce climate performance labels, and train staff on the eco communication. And these are potential clauses that may be reflected here. So these are potential scenarios that might be. I hope this helps you understand what is the difference between the requirement in a 14,001 and a 9,001, which I'll brief in this slide. So basically, in 9,001, you are checking climate impact on your ability to provide a service, which might trigger a question that, okay, it's because of a stakeholder requirement. I need to make sure my climate impact is reduced, which will trigger me to go to 14,001. At the same time, 14,001 is only about minimizing the environmental impact of the business. In 9,001, your requirement is to understand, to integrate climate into the quality performance of the business itself, how the climate impact can affect the quality of the service that you're giving. But in 14,001, your expectation is only to ensure your environmental impact and objectives and targets and compliance are met. In 9,001, because of this amendment, now you're required to ensure any stakeholders that's not only has a vested interest in your quality, but vested interest in your climate impact as well. In 14,001, it's just about the climate expectation from a stakeholder. Here, you have to understand the quality as well and the environmental impact indirectly. So what do we do basically to start compliance on this area? So basically, what we need to do essentially is understand if you have a risk, understand if you have a climate impact that needs or climate opportunity that needs to be addressed. If you do, you have to manage that stakeholder requirements. You have to manage that risk and use the risk registers or whatever mechanism you use to manage those. You have to include these into management reviews, internal audits, and you have to set up quality objectives and long-term climate resilience. So these are some of the steps, but it specifically depends on what is the risk that you have identified. Now, there are questions where we may not have a climate impact identified. That's fine. We'll talk about that as well. So just to just to give a few other points that we need to consider. So this again is not just about being green. It's about being resilient. It's about being prepared for anything that the climate impact can affect. And this is not just for a few industries that are traditionally huge carbon footprint companies or something like that. It can affect any industry, and the question can come to you this year or next year in your external audit or in your certification audits. Now, again, it's also a starting point to your sustainability goals. It also helps starting that journey towards sustainability and minimizing your climate impact as well. So that's why it's really important to start on this process as soon as possible. Now, some of the frequently asked questions which I mentioned earlier. Do we need to rewrite our entire QMS? You may not. You may have a specific clause that's affected. You might need to make some amendments there. That's the only area that you need to affect. What if climate doesn't impact us? Now, it's really unlikely that there is a company that has no climate impact at all. Maybe you don't see it as a climate impacting you, but there will be a customer at the end of the day who will, at the end of the day, want only to procure service or products from a green company or a net zero company at the end of the day. I was thinking of examples where there might be no impact at all, and I was really struggling to find a company. Let's take a accountancy firm that's 3 or 4 members. It's just an office. They are not providing any products. They are not traveling to any client sites. They are working remote, providing advice, and they're giving reports. And they have decided, but they're still using electricity. They're still printing stuff. They're still using ink. But once we identify what are the potential risks, they can start controlling those and minimize their impact. It's not that you can mitigate it entirely, but minimize where possible. So it's about taking the effort to sit down together and understand, are we affected by climate change, or do we have an impact on climate back as well, and making sure we take the initiative and move forward from there. Now, will auditors ask questions about this, and which is 100%. We have seen this as happening in all the external audits, and I believe there's a directive from certification bodies to specifically ask questions about this when we look at the risk management aspect and clause 4.1. But I've seen in the first years it's been a bit relaxed because they've given the time to take up this, and they've given enough time to imbibe this into the system. But moving forward, I would see that it's much more strict, and it will cause it to create majors or minors depending on the level of impact it can have on your business. So summary, basically, this is about understanding your climate impact of climate change on you. And this is not an optional requirement. This is mandatory for everyone, and demonstrate, and you have to show you have put effort to understand the impact and taken some actions. How you take the actions depends on the type of issue that you identify.